Okay, welcome to our video recap of our next chapter, Morality and the Novel. Now, before we get into the content, I suppose I need to correct myself briefly. In the last video, I mentioned that in the center chapters, Jane Smiley was going to focus more on the kind of broader craft thinking about novels, as opposed to diving into a whole bunch of them for these deep sorts of analyses of specific texts. And if you've read this chapter already, you will have noticed that I was wrong. I had forgotten that she, in this chapter, really dives into a number of texts, and I've listed them all here, moving from, medieval Spain all the way up to right at the cusp of the 20th century and Lady Chatterley's Lover. And once again, I think she does such a brilliant job of analyzing the way morality unspools or is explored in these texts that I don't need to necessarily highlight how she interprets those particular items. But what we'll talk about in this video is the broader movements and ideas that she is using those as evidence of, or examples of, demonstrations of, as we think about what does it mean to think about morality in our own novels. So one thing and so the place I want to start is one is this very, again, she bangs off all of these essays with, I think, really quotable opening sentiments. All novels, because they move repeatedly between action and reflection, as we talked about in the last chapter, are simultaneously about private experience and public events. For this reason, morality is a perennial gray area in the novel. And what this makes me think about, that I want to talk about as we're thinking about this question of morality within novels, is, although you probably discovered from reading the this chapter, there are a number of novels, not as many in the contemporary world, that take on moralistic issues and have morality in them. But in contemporary writing, especially, this is usually very gray area. So there's not necessarily, at the end of the day, as a novelist, a particular moral lesson that you, as the writer, should be trying to impart, so much as questions about what is right, what is wrong, getting readers to think about their own sort of moral lens, ethical lens for various things and ways of thinking and experiencing the world, right? And so that's, I think, worth keeping in mind. We'll see in a later slide here, the fact that the writers of the 18th and 19th century became more kind of interested in why does certain moral turpitude, so to speak, exist within certain people, and why does it come to be, and why do people act in certain ways, as opposed to making some kind of moral judgments of those things. Now, sometimes the bad guys get what's coming to them, sometimes they don't. But the movement into the contemporary world is less, you should find this person bad and you should agree with me that they're bad, and more thinking about the psychology, to harken back to our last chapter, of why does someone end up doing the things that they do? What does it mean to be moral or immoral, right? Now, obviously, there are hopefully some subjects, and she touches on these in a number of places, that we can all generally agree are good or bad. But these days, for example, it generally doesn't really take a novel to suggest what Harriet Beecher Stowe suggested in Uncle Tom's Cabin. Her whole point was this polemic about the immorality of slavery. One would generally hope that we can say that slavery is bad and that we don't necessarily need a novel to tell us so anymore. This is not to say that we should forget history or that stories of what it was like to be a slave aren't important, but the idea that the center point is, hey, I'm trying to convince you that slavery is bad, is not really the function of morality in novels anymore. So that's kind of the larger scale questions that we're going to look at in this quick video. So another large thing that I think becomes significant for us is thinking about characterization and morality. And this goes back a little bit to the notion of levels of play in the psychology of the novel. So I'm just going to read this quote and let us think about it. The character may set out only to report his or her adventures, but because the novel always moves between action and reflection, soon enough, he or she is bringing to bear his or her intentions, desires, regrets, fears, self-justifications, and other more secret thoughts. If the character tries to merely report actions, they quickly become confusing because without feelings, actions don't carry enough emotional weight to remain clear in the reader's mind, right? And so I think this is a worthwhile thing thinking about when we talk about emotionality or emotional experience for characters. This is what we're getting at. Like, why do they do the things they do? Now, this doesn't mean that you need a cavalcade of the narrator or a character telling us why they're doing everything that they're doing. But when we can understand the emotional state, the things that are driving those things, like desires, regrets, and fears, the reasons they justify the choices they make, that's where we get into complex moral territory. You know, one thing that I always tell writers is that I don't have to agree with the choices that a character makes, and I don't have to think that the character is making either smart or moral decisions. But to be compelled by someone, I just need to be able to think through and figure out why they're doing them. Okay. Whether I think that they have the logical underpinnings, and there are several references to logic in this chapter, is not I have to think it's good logic, or I have to think, ooh, that's the right way to do that. But I have to see that there is logic beneath the surface. I need to be able to see how the character got input, so the things around them, the things happening to them, and how they process that and got to their output, whether it's a thing I would do or not. Okay. So just worth thinking about. So just to again, because so much of this chapter is about these deep dives into these texts, which again, even if you haven't read them, I think provide some really good ways of making you ruminate on how you want to present the stories you want to tell. I'll hit on sort of a few highlights here. So first, we'll talk about, at length, she talks about these differences that she observes between Voltaire's Candide and de Sade's Justine. And this idea of addressing morality and evil that shows up in these kind of older, quote unquote, older novels, where the reason I say direct here is that in Candide, the whole story is about someone believing we live in the best of all worlds, so the best must be constantly present. And they go out and try to test that, and they find out that that's not true. So like they are literally the plot is about morality. Versus Justine, where it's what I will call more experiential, right? And so what that means is Justine goes through all these horrific things, and that is the way that de Sade is showing us what the world and its moral problems are. Okay, so just to sort of so I would certainly say that Candide, the approach that Voltaire takes in Candide is not exactly of de rigueur. Right? Writers and readers these days don't really want to read stories of I'm trying to figure out if everybody's good or not. And that's my plot, right? We want something a little more complex, more experiential. And so one of the things that helps us in growth is what she says on page 113. Novelists gradually became more adept at analyzing what has turned out to be one of the novel's most fertile subjects, the morality of personal relationships. And really, if that's not the core of every story, and we use those individual personal relationships to say something about the world, as she talks about in Wuthering Heights, right? The personal relationship between Catherine and Heathcliff is the way that Bronte talked about the world. And that's why that has become such a long-standing thing. I don't know of a single novel that, especially if you are willing to have a little bit of creative flexibility about what the term personal relationships means, I can't think of a single novel that doesn't have a personal relationship in it. And that's because you can spool out so much about the world, about the human experience through personal relationships. And then I'm just going to bring up this because it's going to lead into the next section that I'm going to talk about is how she takes us turn toward the question of the vocation of the novel that from the beginning has been the portrayal of brutes, criminals, and psychopaths. I think that's because the context of evil and wrongdoing fascinates us. It captivates us, right? I would say that we've talked about how characters need to never be perfect and never be completely evil, but I would say that if you're going to choose one of those, the one that people are more willing to watch or read or be entertained by is someone who's wholly evil is for some reason more compelling and fascinating than someone who is wholly good. I don't know why. I think there's a lot of psychological reasons for that. I won't get into them here, but I think this is one of the things that interests us as brutes, criminals, and psychopaths. And so what I'm going to address here is how she takes us through this really interesting set by way of Dickens and Harry Beecher Stowe, and then Sir Walter Scott, as well as trying to remember here by looking through the pages, Madame Bovary, et cetera, and ending with Lady Chatterley's lover. This idea of how evil has been portrayed, not just the portrayal of external evil doing, but what causes it, right? So this all starts in the 18th century. Novelists were sort of interested in the motives and the rationales for evil actions. And from there, going into the early 19th century, the notion was that evil was this kind of constant of human nature. The American Romantics can be really broken down into, for example, the Gothic writers and the Transcendentalists. And this is where we get into these next 2 points about that what was at the heart of the nature of good and evil was secrecy and silence, keeping the things that have created you internal and not talking about them. And then also we get these explorations of cause and effect, what causes this. But anyway, to come back to in American writing, in the Romantic period, you can see this bifurcation. So the Gothic writers, probably the big ones would be Nathaniel Hawthorne, Edgar Allan Poe. They viewed humankind as naturally fallen and flawed, that their inherent, the inherent cause was human nature, and the effect was the wrongdoing that they committed. They were what we call the Gothic writers. Then you had the light romantics, the transcendentalists, your Henry David Thoreau, your Ralph Waldo Emerson, even your Walt Whitman, who believed that although humankind was quote unquote fallen, they had the moral capacity to be good, right? That the default was not this evil, this dwelling in the moral basement. But as Jane Smiley talks about here, one of the things that starts transforming as we get into the 19th century, particularly with her examples of Charles Dickens and Harry Beecher Stowe, and then into even Madame Bovary, is this question of what is the cause of these things? Why is it that Uriah Heep is the bad guy, is how he is? Why is it that we end up with, Carker the manager, Madame Defarge? Like, what is it that drives these things? And then we start to see this as it flings itself into the 20th century. And the big question that the modernists, postmodernists, and many contemporary writers are still exploring is this question of what is morality? Is it a set of personal choices having to do with like a prescribed right or wrong? She references the 10 Commandments, right? Is what makes something right or wrong, whether it's in alignment with these things that are all based on an individual's choices, or has a larger, more meta thing, macro level problem of this inequitable distribution and abuse of power and wealth? Is that a component of morality? If someone does something bad, are they driven by themselves? Are they driven by a larger structure? That becomes the larger world structure becomes a really big thing in postmodernism. And so those become sort of these more, the questions of morality and evil become even more complex and more complicated. And you can even trace this if you've read any 18th century literature going into the early 19th century. The moral bearings, the who is good, who is evil, are often far clearer than necessarily in 20th and 21st century literature. And so I'll end with this, that she says 20th century novelists, and I think we can include ourselves as 21st century novelists, are not able to return to the pre-Dickensian idea of evil as randomly distributed, causeless, and incorrigible. Trying to write a story of pure good, pure evil, people don't buy it anymore. And so when you're thinking about your own stories, yes, you want to go back to that question of like, what am I trying to say, quote unquote, say about morality and immorality, or what is good, what is right, what is wrong, but also what does that look like in the way that characters are depicted on the page? It's really hard to have a character who is completely evil and totally unlikable, or a character who is perfectly good. They're often still unlikable. But what is it that makes them more interesting and more complex along the way? Okay, so those are my thoughts on this chapter on morality in the novel. And as always, I will be curious to see what it is that you have to say.